Remember Verdine White. His biggest secret will shock you. He was the heartbeat of one of the greatest bands in history, a man whose smile lit up arenas yet whose silence hid a truth no one expected. For decades, Verdine White of Earth, Wind, and Fire dazzled the world with his energy and perfection, but behind the rhythm lay a secret buried in fame, fortune, and family. What was he protecting? And why now are people finally asking questions? Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear will change how you see this legendary group forever. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join Legends of Black Excellence, where the truth behind the music lives on. Part 1. The secret behind the legend, Verdine White. He wasn't just a bassist, he was the pulse, the movement, the living spark of a band that changed the face of black music forever. Verdine White, the man whose smile lit up stages across continents, was more than a performer. He was the keeper of rhythm style, and as many would later discover, a secret buried deep beneath decades of success. To fans, he embodied joy and grace, the shimmering symbol of Earth, Wind, and Fire's perfection. But behind that dazzling energy lay untold stories, moments of silence, decisions made in the shadows, and truths that even his closest peers never saw coming. When Earth, Wind, and Fire exploded onto the scene in the early 1970s, they didn't just make music. They redefined what a black group could achieve on a global stage. Their fusion of funk, soul, jazz, and mysticism transcended boundaries. They became the first African-American supergroup to headline stadiums worldwide, to merge African spirituality with mainstream sound, and to influence generations from Chicago to Tokyo. Verdine, with his flowing hair and lightning-fast bass, was their heartbeat, the foundation beneath Maurice White's celestial vision. Audiences saw glamour light and spiritual energy, but few noticed the discipline behind it. Verdine was known for his obsession with precision, rehearsing endlessly until every note felt like divine alignment. Yet those who worked closely with him often sensed something unspoken, a heaviness behind the laughter. He protected the band's image fiercely, rarely granting interviews and deflecting personal questions with charm. But as time went on, whispers began to circulate. Was Verdine hiding something about the band's past? For years, that mystery lingered. Every time Earth, Wind, and Fire took the stage, fans felt the magic. But the man anchoring the groove seemed to carry more than just music in his hands. He carried responsibility, loyalty, and maybe guilt. Decades later, when questions resurfaced about money, leadership, and internal conflict, all roads led back to him. Now, as the world looks back at Earth, Wind, and Fire's golden legacy, the spotlight has shifted from the songs to the secrets. What did Verdine White really know? What was he protecting all those years? Behind the glitter and gold lies a revelation that might change how we remember one of music's most iconic legends forever. Part 2. The Golden Era of Earth, Wind, and Fire. By the mid to late 1970s, Earth, Wind, and Fire had become a living symbol of musical innovation and cultural unity. Under the leadership of Maurice White, the ensemble didn't just perform, they created experiences that felt almost spiritual. Their concerts blended cosmic visuals, African mysticism, and messages of self-awareness that resonated across continents. Each release turned into an event. That's the Way of the World went multi-platinum. Spirit reached the top 10, and all in all sold millions, earning the band multiple Grammy Awards. Audiences across America, Europe, and Asia couldn't get enough of their sound, a fusion of rhythm, harmony, and soul that redefined what black artistry could achieve globally. At the heart of that triumph was Maurice White, a visionary who combined jazz sophistication with funk power and spiritual depth. He wasn't just a band leader, he was a composer, producer, philosopher, and architect of an entire movement. He envisioned Earth, Wind, and Fire as more than entertainment. It was a mission to uplift consciousness through rhythm. His belief in positivity and cosmic alignment gave the band its distinct aura. While others chased trends, Maurice created timeless messages like "Keep your head to the sky" and "Shining Star," inspiring listeners to dream beyond their circumstances. Yet behind the glory, creative tension was beginning to simmer. Al McKay, the brilliant guitarist and arranger responsible for some of their most unforgettable grooves, felt increasingly overlooked. McKay co-wrote September, a track that would go on to define a generation, yet his name rarely appeared in headlines. Maurice's perfectionism and control over the group's direction left little space for recognition among the other members. McKay's infectious guitar rhythms, the driving force behind hits like "Sing a Song" and "Fantasy," often faded into the shadow of Maurice's public image. Still, during those golden years, everything seemed untouchable. Every performance sold out, every radio station played their hits, and every award show echoed their name. Their mix of soulful vocals, sharp horns, and intricate choreography elevated them far beyond their peers. Fans saw harmony on stage, unaware of the quiet storm brewing behind the curtain. The world celebrated Earth, Wind, and Fire as gods of sound, but within the circle, creative frustration was growing. In the glow of fame, ambition clashed with recognition, setting the stage for the cracks that would soon appear in their empire. Part 3. The Creative Rift. Al McKay walks away. By 1980, the unstoppable machine that was Earth, Wind, and Fire began to show its first visible cracks. At the center of the tension stood Al McKay, the genius guitarist and songwriter whose infectious riffs and arrangements had powered the band's biggest hits. For years, McKay had poured his creativity into the group's success, co-writing the timeless September, shaping Fantasy and designing grooves that turned every concert into a celebration. Yet despite his immense contribution, he felt invisible. The spotlight, the media attention, and the financial rewards all seemed to orbit one man, Maurice White. Publicly, the narrative was simple. Maurice was the mastermind, the philosopher, the visionary who guided Earth, Wind, and Fire to greatness. Behind the scenes, however, McKay and several other musicians felt sidelined. While Maurice handled production and image building, the creative process was far more collaborative than outsiders realized. McKay's guitar work gave their songs a rhythmic heartbeat. His arrangements added the signature brightness that defined their sound. But his requests for fair credit and royalties were often dismissed or delayed. That unspoken resentment began to spread quietly across rehearsals, studio sessions, and world tours. As the band's success reached new heights, so did the stakes. Every tour grossed millions. Every release went platinum. But money and power complicated everything. When McKay confronted management about unpaid royalties and authorship rights, he was met with silence or vague promises. Official statements later blamed his exit on creative differences, but insiders knew the truth ran deeper. It was about respect, recognition, and ownership of a legacy he helped build. Verdine, White, always the loyal brother and bassist, stayed out of the conflict, focusing instead on keeping the rhythm intact. He admired both men, but understood that egos in such a massive enterprise could be explosive. As McKay walked away in frustration, Maurice refused to publicly address the issue, choosing instead to push forward without one of the band's core architects. McKay's departure marked a defining shift. The chemistry that once made Earth, Wind, and Fire feel invincible began to fade. Though the group continued to perform, the unity that fueled their golden era was gone. Al McKay's exit wasn't just another lineup change, it was the first sign that even legends can fracture when pride, credit, and money collide. Part 4. Behind the Brilliance. Maurice White's Hidden Battle. By the dawn of the 1980s, Earth, Wind, and Fire stood atop the musical world, kings of funk, prophets of positivity, and pioneers of a sound that transcended color and culture. Yet behind the shimmering lights, glittering costumes, and thunderous applause, the cracks of exhaustion began to show. The non-stop tours demanding recording schedules and expectation to produce another hit after every success had drained even the most disciplined members. At the center of it all was Maurice White, the band's founder, leader, and creative compass. He had built Earth, Wind, and Fire into a symbol of excellence, but now, the weight of that empire was crushing him from the inside. Throughout the 1970s, Maurice had been relentless, recording, producing, managing, and conceptualizing every aspect of the group's image. He believed in perfection, rehearsing until every note, every horn section, and every dance step aligned with his vision. But perfection came with a cost. Endless tours across continents left little time for rest or reflection. Each concert felt like a victory, yet behind the curtain, fatigue, creative burnout, and internal tension loomed. As other artists experimented with electronic production, Maurice struggled to balance innovation with authenticity. By the early 80s, the music landscape was shifting. The arrival of synthpop and drum machines began to eclipse traditional funk and soul. Bands were expected to sound more mechanical, more digital, a direction that clashed with Maurice's organic approach to music making. While he admired progress, he feared losing the essence that had made Earth, Wind, and Fire unique. Record executives pushed for a modern sound. Maurice wanted to preserve the spirit. That creative tug-of-war pushed him harder than ever. Then came the first signs of something far more sinister. Small tremors in his hands. A subtle stiffness that made playing the kalimba, his sacred African thumb piano, increasingly difficult. He dismissed it as exhaustion, the natural toll of decades on stage, but the symptoms persisted. After months of tests and confusion, doctors gave the devastating diagnosis Parkinson's disease. For a man whose entire identity was built on movement, rhythm, and control, it felt like an invisible thief stealing everything he had built. Refusing to surrender, Maurice chose silence. He shared the truth with only a handful of people, including his brother Verdine White, who immediately vowed to protect his secret. Verdine noticed the subtle changes, the shaking hands, the quieter presence, but stood by him unconditionally. Together, they continued to tour with Verdine, gradually assuming more responsibility behind the scenes. To the public, Earth, Wind, and Fire remained unstoppable. No one imagined that their leader was fighting a battle his body could never win. As the decade unfolded, the burden became unbearable. Maurice's condition advanced, and his once commanding stage energy began to fade. Simple tasks grew harder, studio sessions more painful. Still, he refused to let illness define his art. When he could no longer perform physically, he turned his focus to production, mentoring, and songwriting. He became a quiet force behind the curtain, ensuring that the band's light never dimmed, even as his own strength waned. Meanwhile, the group's saxophonist, Don Myrick, illustrated another form of tragedy. The endless pressure, fame, and the lure of the nightlife consumed him. Addiction became his escape, a mirror to the unseen toll that constant success demanded. His later death during a police raid in 1993 symbolized the dark undercurrent running beneath Earth, Wind, and Fire's celestial image, a reminder that behind every standing ovation, real people were breaking. By the time Maurice officially stepped away from performing in the late 1980s, fans were unaware of the truth. Verdine carried the band forward, determined to honor his brother's legacy while concealing the pain that lingered behind every note. When Maurice finally revealed his illness publicly years later, the world was stunned not by his weakness, but by his courage. His silence had not been denial. It had been devotion. Maurice White's hidden struggle became the ultimate testament to his strength. Even as his body failed him, his vision, a world united through rhythm and spirit, continued to thrive, carried by Verdine, his bandmates, and generations, inspired by his sound. Part 5. The Tragic Fall of Don Myrick. Don Myrick was the soul behind the sound, the man whose saxophone could cry, whisper, and soar all within a single note. When he stepped into a studio or onto a stage, the world stopped to listen. His solo in Reasons remains one of the most emotional moments in Earth, Wind, and Fire's vast catalog. A melody that seemed to speak directly to the heart. Behind that horn was a musician who had lived and breathed rhythm since childhood, a man who rose from Chicago's jazz scene to play on some of the most celebrated records of his era. Yet behind his gift lay a struggle that few ever understood. By the late 1980s, Don's life had begun to unravel. The endless cycle of touring, studio deadlines, and the unpredictable chaos of fame had taken a toll. Like many artists of his generation, he was lured into the dark corners of the industry where easy access to drugs and constant pressure collided. Friends described him as gentle and spiritual, yet haunted by inner conflict. His addiction battles slowed his career, distancing him from the stability he once found in Earth, Wind and Fire's golden years. When Maurice White began withdrawing from live performances due to his illness, Myrick also drifted further into solitude. The band that had once given him purpose seemed to dissolve piece by piece, and Don struggled to adapt to a quieter, lonelier world. Still, he never stopped playing. Local gigs, small collaborations, teaching sessions, his saxophone remained his lifeline. Then came July 30th, 1993, a day that would mark one of the darkest moments in music history. Police officers raided Myrick's Los Angeles apartment, reportedly searching for drugs. According to official reports, Don made a suspicious movement, and within seconds a gunshot echoed through the air. He was struck once in the chest and died almost instantly. When the search ended, no narcotics were found. The news sent shockwaves through the community. Fans, musicians, and civil rights activists questioned everything. Why was deadly force used? Why was he targeted at all? Many believed his death reflected the same systemic bias that had claimed so many other black lives. Maurice White, heartbroken, called Myrick's passing a tragedy that never should have happened. To those who knew him, Don was more than a musician. He was a vessel of emotion, a reminder of how fragile brilliance can be. His untimely death exposed a painful truth. Even legends are not safe from injustice. Today, every time Reasons plays, his spirit returns a haunting echo of genius pain and a life cut far too short. Part 6. The Transition. Verdine steps into the spotlight. When Maurice White finally stepped away from the spotlight, a silence fell over the world of Earth, Wind and Fire. For the first time in decades, the group's guiding voice was gone. His health no longer allowed him to tour, but his influence lingered in every chord and lyric. In his absence, the responsibility to carry that immense legacy forward fell upon his younger brother, Verdine White, the man who had stood by his side since the beginning. Verdine wasn't just a bassist anymore. He was now the face, the spirit, and the anchor of a dynasty. The transition was anything but simple. Fans were divided. Some praised Verdine's leadership, admiring his dedication to keeping the band's energy alive. Others felt the soul of Earth, Wind and Fire had faded without Maurice's mystical presence. Critics wondered whether the group could survive without its founding visionary. Yet Verdine, known for his charisma and unbreakable optimism, pressed forward with quiet strength. He refused to let the magic die. Determined to honor his brother's vision, Verdine restructured the band with new musicians while keeping its signature sound intact. He brought back the horns, harmonies, and uplifting themes that defined their identity. Even as trends shifted toward digital music, Verdine maintained Earth, Wind and Fire's organic essence, blending nostalgia with fresh production to captivate new audiences. Behind the scenes, Maurice continued to mentor him, offering advice from afar. The two shared an unspoken understanding. Maurice had built the foundation, and Verdine would keep the flame burning. Through years of touring revivals and Grammy tributes, Verdine transformed grief into purpose. Though the group would never again feel quite the same, his leadership ensured that Earth, Wind and Fire didn't fade into history. Instead, it evolved resilient, radiant, and eternal, a living tribute to the brotherhood that started it all. Part 7. The Money Wars Lawsuits. Royalties and Secrets. After Maurice White's passing in 2016, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Fans celebrated his genius, musicians hailed his innovation, and critics called him one of the greatest architects of soul. But as the world mourned, a shadow began to stretch over the Earth, Wind, and Fire legacy, a shadow shaped by money contracts and the unspoken secrets left behind. For years, whispers of unpaid royalties and financial mismanagement had followed the band. But after Maurice's death, those whispers turned into lawsuits. In 2012, the family of the late producer Charles Stepney reignited a controversy that had simmered for decades. Stepney, the brilliant arranger who co-created the band's lush orchestral sound, was responsible for the sophistication that made tracks like Fantasy and That's the Way of the World eternal. Yet his estate claimed that despite his enormous influence, he had never received proper compensation for his work. Court filings alleged that millions in royalties were withheld or mishandled through complex business dealings under Maurice's production empire, Kalimba Productions. The accusations raised painful questions. How could a group that stood for positivity and unity harbor such deep financial fractures? At the heart of the storm stood Verdine White, the last original member still active, and now the de facto guardian of the Earth, Wind, and Fire legacy. As the lawsuits surfaced, journalists and former associates turned their attention toward him. Was Verdine aware of where the money had gone? Or had he simply inherited a financial mess created long before he took control? Though he denied any wrongdoing, his silence only deepened public curiosity. Looking back, the roots of the controversy ran deep. In the 1970s, Earth, Wind, and Fire was not only a band, it was an expanding enterprise. Maurice envisioned a creative empire that included studios, labels, and publishing arms. But ambition came with risk. Extravagant spending on stage productions, costly tours, and elaborate business ventures stretched the group's finances thin. Over time, accounting blurred and loyalties mixed with business decisions. For Verdine, the battle wasn't only about defending his name, it was about protecting the band's honor. The revelations about unpaid royalties and hidden contracts painted a more complicated picture of their empire, dazzling on the surface, fragile underneath. The big secret wasn't one of betrayal or crime, but of consequence, a reminder that even brilliance can be undone by the very ambition that built it. Part 8. The Sound of Conflict. When art and commerce collide. By 1983, the once unshakable magic of Earth, Wind, and Fire began to dim. The release of Electric Universe marked a bold but divisive shift and experiment that collided with the rise of synth-pop drum machines and digital textures dominating the charts. Maurice White, always the visionary, believed modernization was essential. He wanted the band to evolve with the times, embracing electronic production while maintaining their spiritual essence. But the result was jarring. The warmth of live horns, the layered harmonies, and the soulful grooves that had defined their sound for a decade were replaced with cold, metallic tones. Fans who had grown up with September and Boogie Wonderland struggled to recognize their beloved group. The critical response was swift and unforgiving. While the album contained strong songwriting, audiences felt disconnected. Sales dropped sharply, marking one of the lowest points in the band's commercial history. Radio stations that once played Earth, Wind, and Fire non-stop began turning toward newer, flashier acts. What had once been a movement of unity and soul now sounded out of step with the world it helped inspire. Inside the band, creative tension reached its breaking point. Al McKay, who had already left but remained symbolically tied to the group's identity, spoke out against the musical direction. He believed the essence of Earth, Wind, and Fire was rooted in live musicianship, in the organic chemistry between real instruments and human energy, not synthetic beats. Maurice disagreed, convinced that progress demanded reinvention. Their opposing philosophies became a metaphor for a larger conflict: artistry versus adaptation. Caught in the middle was Verdine White, the ever-loyal anchor desperately trying to bridge two worlds. He understood his brother's desire to innovate, but he also felt the soul slipping away. His role became that of peacemaker, holding together musicians torn between loyalty and disillusionment. Eventually, the strain was too much. After Electric Universe underperformed, the group quietly went on hiatus. Maurice turned to solo projects and production work while other members pursued independent paths. The unity that once seemed unbreakable had fractured. For the first time, the future of Earth, Wind, and Fire was uncertain. What had begun as a daring artistic experiment ended as a sobering reminder even legends can lose their rhythm when the heart of their sound drifts too far from its roots. Part 9. The Sampling Wars Protecting the Legacy. As the 1990s unfolded, Earth, Wind, and Fire found themselves facing a new kind of challenge, not from rival bands or changing musical trends, but from the evolving technology that defined the decade. Sampling had become the new creative frontier in hip-hop and dance music, with producers borrowing classic hooks and rhythms to build modern hits. Yet behind that innovation lay a growing legal storm. Iconic recordings from black musicians of the 1970s were being reused without acknowledgement or payment. For Maurice and Verdine White, who had dedicated their lives to originality and craft, this was personal. The most high-profile clash came when the Italian dance act Black Box and singer Loleatta Holloway became embroiled in controversy over unlicensed vocals and instrumental loops. Their hit songs had lifted elements inspired by Earth, Wind, and Fire's style and structure, tight horn sections, layered harmonies, and rhythmic bass lines without authorization. The case drew global attention, exposing the murky ethics of the new sampling culture. For Verdine, this wasn't merely a business issue, it was a matter of artistic respect. Too many black artists, he argued, had built the foundations of popular music only to see their work repackaged by others for profit. Under Maurice White's guidance, the group pursued legal protection for their catalog. He was no longer touring actively due to his illness, but his presence was still felt in every decision. Behind closed doors, he pushed for stronger publishing rights, tighter licensing terms, and fair credit for the pioneers who had shaped an entire soundscape. Their fight wasn't just about royalties, it was about rewriting how the industry valued creators. The lawsuits that followed throughout the 1990s became part of a wider cultural reckoning. Labels and producers were forced to recognize that innovation required acknowledgement. Artists could no longer hide behind claims of creative borrowing. Because of those confrontations, copyright law evolved, demanding proper clearance for every sample used. In the years that followed, Earth, Wind, and Fire's influence only deepened. Their music continued to be referenced, studied, and legally licensed by new generations of performers. Verdine, still active, often described those battles as necessary education for the industry. The message was clear. True artistry deserved protection. The group's legacy wasn't only in the songs they recorded, it was in the rights they fought to preserve for every musician who came after them. Part 10. The final question. What was Verdine hiding? As the curtain falls on the saga of Earth, Wind, and Fire, what remains is more than a discography. It's a legend carved in triumph, tragedy, and unanswered questions. Over half a century, the group soared from neighborhood gigs to global stages, selling more than 90 million records and redefining the sound of black excellence. Yet behind the glittering awards, platinum plaques, and cosmic philosophy, there were human stories of loyalty, tested friendships, broken and legacies complicated by time. When Maurice White passed, the world mourned the loss of a visionary. His melodies became anthems for generations, but his death also reopened wounds left unresolved. Lawsuits, conflicting memories, and unspoken grievances lingered among those who had once shared the same stage. Verdine White. The eternal showman became the last living guardian of their empire, the keeper of the groove, and perhaps the keeper of the truth. Some saw him as a devoted brother preserving the dream. Others whispered that he knew far more than he ever revealed. The band's journey mirrors life itself, brilliance intertwined with imperfection. They brought joy to millions, yet internally faced battles that success could not heal. As decades passed, their music outlived the arguments, their rhythm survived the fractures, and their legacy stood taller than any controversy. But still, the haunting question remains: could some of those bonds have been saved if honesty had come sooner? And what exactly did Verdine White hide all those years? Every time September plays and crowds dance without knowing the pain behind the harmony, their story feels both immortal and unfinished. Perhaps that's the true mark of greatness, to leave behind not just sound, but mystery. The spirit of earth, wind, and fire still burns shimmering between memory and myth, its final note unresolved yet eternal. The story of Earth, Wind, and Fire is one of brilliance, loyalty, and unanswered truth. Maurice White built an empire of sound. Verdine White kept its flame alive. Yet decades later, fans still ask what was really hidden behind the music. Were the wounds of fame ever healed? Or were they simply buried beneath gold records and silence? As their legacy shines brighter than ever, one question refuses to fade. Did Verdine protect the dream or conceal the truth? Tell us what you believe only on Legends of Black Excellence, where the legends live and the truth never sleeps.